matter that's off the table is taking a pass on it. We've got to act. Senator Cornyn, you're next.
Good morning, Madam Secretary. When you testified before this committee almost 2 years ago, you were asked whether inflation was transitory. And you told the committee that you saw important transitory influences at work, but you did not anticipate that inflation would be in any way permanent. You predicted our economy was on track to get back to more normal operation, and that inflation would decline over time, something we all hoped for. To be fair, you weren't the only person who forecast transitory inflation. The chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, did the same, as did the President of the United States. We now know that inflation rose to a level not seen in more than 40 years, and that inflation accelerated, particularly following the enactment of the partisan American Rescue Plan Act in 2021, and then with the so-called Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, which together added $2.6 trillion to our national debt. Obviously, all this stimulus going into a constrained economy with supply chains the way they were, workforce levels down, obviously created, was like pouring gasoline on the inflation fire. And though inflation has now come down to 6% or so, that's hardly good news to my constituents who are still struggling to keep up with rising costs. We know both record housing costs, which we've talked about a little bit here today, and high grocery bills are squeezing consumers all across the country. And to make matters worse, real average hourly earnings, the cash earnings of all workers, adjusted for inflation, declined last month and are down over the last year. In other words, because of inflation, workers have gotten a pay cut. Well, first we saw high inflation and then higher interest rates, of course, and that brings me to the failure of the Silicon Valley Bank and another bank in this last week. Some have suggested that this was an example of mismanagement at a time of higher interest rates and higher inflation. Others are saying, where are the regulators? Were they asleep at the wheel? Many have suggested that banking regulators need to focus more on regulating banks, protecting depositors and taxpayers, instead of straying off course and examining so-called climate-related risks and other social engineering goals. I think these are all fair points. When you look at the confluence of concerning economic factors, there is one unavoidable truth. We need to get our fiscal house in order, something that the administration pays lip service to, but which seems uninterested in working with Republicans to try to address. And the president's budget proposal, of course, just makes that clear, because it offers more taxes, more spending, and more debt. Spending would be at historical levels relative to the economy. The national debt would continue to grow. Social Security and Medicare, which are on a path to insolvency. There is no proposal from the president to deal with these impending disasters. Of course, interest costs to service this debt would reach about $1 trillion annually. Our ability to defend our country in an increasingly dangerous world would be diminished because we'd be spending more money paying interest to the bondholders rather than paying to keep the American people safe. And Americans, of course, would be punished with trillions in higher taxes at a time when tax revenues are already at historical levels. It's not that the American people are taxed too little, it's that the federal government continues to spend too much and incur too much debt, which in turn creates this unvirtuous cycle. One final point, last year the administration pushed through an $80 billion blank check for the IRS without a spending plan. Only in Washington, D.C. would Congress pass an $80 billion spending appropriation without any plan as to how it's going to be implemented. And we were told, well, it will be forthcoming. That's great, but that's the opposite of what you would do it in the real world. First, you would want to know what is the plan, and then you would ask, how much does it take to finance or pay for that plan. Well, now the administration wants another $29 billion, which would bring the total up to $110 billion. This, of course, is going to mean more audits, more red tape, and violate the president's promise that no